I just loved this idea of that my paintings now can be this conversation or this collaboration between my teenage self and my 39-year-old self.
Growing up, Washington, D.C.-based artist Katherine Mann's father was an American Foreign Service officer. Her Taiwanese mother was a teacher and graphic designer. Her father's position had them moving like every 2 or 3 years. She grew up in parts of Asia, the Middle East, and various places in the United States. So her interest in both Chinese brush paintings and Western abstractionism was derived from this early childhood of moving around and relocations, and it just gives her work such a rich and distinct feel. Katherine's art, like her life, has matured into this remarkable tour de force of combining disparate elements and contrasts. It is made by controlling paint, but also freely pouring paint. It speaks to the fragility of nature and its majesty simultaneously. It is bold and confident, but also delicate and super fragile. You can find images of Katherine's art and links to learn more by going to art2life.com and clicking on podcast. Join me for this conversation with Katherine. Her thinking and evolution as an artist demonstrates to us all not only how to embrace our separateness, but to also know our innate shared connection with the world. Welcome to Art2Life, a podcast for the creatively curious. My name is Nicholas Wilton, and each week I'll help you rediscover not just the art of your life, but the art in your life. Join me as we explore that perfect blue at twilight, the wild frontiers of art making, and the extraordinary joy of finding your way as you go. So, Katherine, really super appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us. I'm so excited about your work, and it's so different, and I just can't wait to dive into it. So, again, thanks so much for spending a little time with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very excited for our conversation.
Oh, good,
I'm happy
good,
that you asked me to join.
Yeah, and so catch us up. You're based in Washington, D.C., is that correct?
I am, yes.
Okay, and give us just a little quick background and where you're, where you started. I mean, and then we'll dive into your work.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm based in Washington, D.C. I've been living in D.C. it's been about 12 years now. I'm sort of from the D.C. area, but I actually, as a child, I've moved around all the time. I would move every 2 or 3 years. I'd always come back to the D.C. region, but I'd kind of shuttle between mostly East Asia and the DC area.
Was that like a military thing where your father was connected to some government thing? Or?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. My dad was a Foreign Service officer. So that's the reason for the constant moving. So yeah, that's kind of informs everything about me in the way that I think about art and the way I think about my life outside of art.
Yeah, you're kind of straddling these two worlds of, I mean, your family's from Taiwan, is that correct?
I'm actually half Taiwanese. My mother is from Taiwan and is a Taiwanese American immigrant, and my father is from the upstate New York area.
Right. So yeah, it totally informs your work. Tell us how that does, and maybe also just to catch people up, like, what is your work? Like, what are you making? Yeah, because it's all part of a bigger thing. And by the way, you guys listening, go check out art2life.com. You can see her work there, because you really got to see this it's amazing. These large installations. So go check that out now. And then maybe you can just give us your version of it.
I mean, I'll try. It's always really hard to describe visual work, and it's especially hard, I think, for the artist to describe her own work. It's like we all get tied up in knots thinking about our own work. But I'd say it's I work very large. It's abstract work, but it's pseudo-abstract. It's semi-abstract. There's elements of figurative elements kind of go through my work. It's generally on paper. And it's often very almost cinematically scaled. The biggest piece I've ever made was a public art piece. It was 200 feet long. So they can feel very all encompassing and immersive. And they're all about kind of these juxtapositions and hybrids. So I'm constantly trying to find different visual languages and then smashing them up against one another. There's a lot of collage happening. I bring in elements from traditional sumi ink painting, from Buddhist painting, from Western style landscape painting, and I kind of smash them all together.
Yeah, and it's there. And here's what you're doing, which I think which I'm super jealous about, by the way. I'm like, I love that. Well, so you guys, her work, she cuts all these openings in it. So it's almost like some of the way she's constructing these paintings, and they're not even paintings. I mean, I don't know. They're like scrolls. They're like giant stories that traverse a wall, but they're like, it reminds me of like the paper doll cutout or like fishnets. Like there's openings in many of the pieces. So you're like hanging up these almost like scrims of, and so there's this depth thing going on, which I just love. I love that there's negative space, which is actually areas that are cut out, and then there's the actual space, and there's something that's that juxtaposition of like an opening and then something, like landscape, but it has depth to it. Like you want to go in this, like you describe it, it's like immersive. It really is immersive. I mean, it is, and it's flat, but that's what's like my work. It's just a painting, and it's, everyone knows it's like, it's a flat thing, and there's sort of some depth, but and I was curious, when you attach these pieces, are they like hanging, or do you glue it all flat? Is that why it has that sort of like, when the wind blows on your work, do pieces like move like leaves, or,
It really depends on the piece. So sometimes, like, especially with the cut paper element, I do hang work away from the wall so that there's a shadow happening.
Yeah.
And there's like a little bit of three-dimensionality. I also don't ever get to, I mean, I'm pretty flat also, really. I'm not a sculptor by any means, by any stretch of the imagination. But it can get a little bit of, I'm interested in layering. And that what you're saying about depth, I think about that all the time, and how can a piece feel really immersive without being perspectival? Like, I'm not interested in traditional Western perspective. I don't paint that way, but I do want there to be depth and immersion happening. And I loved what you said. You described, I think you said like stories that go along a wall. That's such a wonderful way to describe it.
Yeah. I mean, literally, there's an invitation to go in. The viewer can go into this work, like Cirque du Soleil should hire you to create the whole damn thing. Like, wouldn't you love that? Like,
I would accept that gig.
Like gimmicky like that. I'm not saying it's like their cheesy thing, but there's an immersive environment of like, I'm going to just take you to a whole new world. And we're all trying to do that with our work, but I think your work really pulls that off, that we feel like we're in a new landscape,
Yeah, I remember when I was a teenager, I studied traditional Chinese painting. And I remember my teacher telling me this myth, this little piece of folklore of a master who was so great at painting that at the end of making a scroll, he would take off his shoes and just wander into the mountains. And that is, it's a very simple idea and a simple story, but that is so lovely to me, that idea of complete escapism and unapologetic escapism is something that I think feels really powerful, and I love that.
Well, and the whole premise of Japanese or Chinese brush painting is that what I love, it's the feeling of the thing, it's not really like a photograph of the thing or rendered to death, but it's like the bamboo, the masters, it feels more real than the thing, it's the feeling first. And I definitely, this applies to your work as well, that it's the feeling of landscape, and that makes it so, it moves us emotionally, but it also is like a landscape then, because the feeling of the thing actually is the powerful thing, the essence of the thing. If you get the essence, you don't need all the like perfect little details. It's not about looking like it. It's the feeling. And you pull that off beautifully.
Thank you so much. I mean, I love that idea also, because in terms of the feeling of the thing, when you think about traditional Chinese painting, a lot of that is in the sense of one gesture or a minimal kind of take on an object or a place. My work is super not minimal at all. It's extremely the opposite, very maximalist. But I am also, I do think of myself as dealing with landscape painting. Maybe I am a landscape painter in some sense of the word.
Oh, yeah. I think so.
But it's that feeling rather than your traditional ideal of what landscape painting is supposed to look like.
Yeah, when I first saw your work, I was like, this is new, but I've been here. Like it's really grounded in the world. It's not just like crazy abstraction, like and you were saying when we were starting here, you're like, well, there's elements of portraiture, or there's elements of figurative, and there's elements, and I can't quite picture what those are, but I think they are kind of set up like landscapes. I don't know why I think that, but maybe they're horizontal, but you go into landscape for inspiration, right? You're looking at landscapes to do it.
Yeah. And when I said the figurative element, I didn't mean like a human figure. I'm not, There's not that much from the human form.
No,
sometimes I do eyes. I do eyes a lot. But other than that, I meant more like those are the elements that are from the landscape. So there's a lot of floral drawing. There's a lot of leaves and natural kind of detritus, like the details of landscape. I'm often actually painting in plein air and literally drawing a leaf that I've, brought in from the yard or something, and bringing them into these abstract landscapes.
So will you go into a landscape, the process, let's say you're doing this, 20-foot painting, or what do you call this? They're not paintings, they're installations, or what is the word you use for your work?
I'd say I'm a painter.
Okay.
Everything is still very connected to painting.
Yeah.
Although some work could be called installation. And then I also do some public work, but that's very painting oriented as well. So pretty comfortable calling myself a painter.
When you're making these, do you say you work in plein air, you'll go out into a landscape and do parts of them and then bring them back? So you'll like stand in front of, go into nature and just do studies, or what are you looking at when you look at a mountain or whatever? You're not copying that mountain, but
I'm definitely not looking at mountains. I'm looking at the small stuff. So I'm looking at the leaf detritus on the ground of the forest, right? Or the weeds that are kind of growing up in the cracks. They're all little things. And those kind of populate my paintings. And they kind of get inserted in. And that's something that I can really hone in on and get really obsessive about how I draw it really, really carefully, but then place them in the painting so that they're next to, a haphazard, ham-handed swath of color or a splash. All of my work actually begins by pouring paint on the paper as it lays on the floor of the studio. So that's a very gestural, automatic, immediate mark, very physical, and it's kind of the opposite of this like careful rendering that happens later. Right. And I like having both of those things in the same space.
Yeah, I think this is what creates a lot of the vitality with the work is and this is how I teach art, by the way, this idea of putting things that are different together, differences, you're pouring paint and then you're studying and doing small, intricate things. And those are so cool when you put them together. So I love that you start with a kind of pour.
Almost every painting starts with a pour. Originally, I kind of thought of the pour itself as the kind of the key to why I painted and what I was interested in. When you pour paint, it's inherently beautiful. I now think of it more as like it's one part of my process. Often the pour actually gets completely covered up. It's not always obvious that it's part of the painting, but it is how I begin. I think of it as kind of the skeleton of the painting. And then I'm building up the flesh around that skeleton. So the skeleton is a chance operation, but then everything that's getting hung on that skeleton is actually quite careful and obsessive. And I like having
like that
things.
The careless, thoughtless, unplanned structure, which normally structure is the opposite, but this is just like what you get. Then you lace that with intentionality and control. And that's what's so cool. But it's interesting how you're flipping that, right?
Yeah.
It's like, we're going to build a building, but we're not going to plan the foundation. We'll dial in the windows, but we're just going to let the, community just do what the hell they want. And then we'll add details later. That's a great flip.
That is such a wonderful metaphor. I think I'm going to keep that. I like that idea of like, building a building, but the entire building is actually, the structure of it is like a big hunk of sand or something.
Yeah, right. Like, we're just, it turns out the building's made out of pancakes, but we're using these really good windows that we get from Germany, and they're just so bomber. That's so cool.
I really love that.
I was watching a video of Andy Warhol, and he was being interviewed by these super heavyweight gallerists, and it was very serious. Mm-hmm. And he had this little dog, and his dog jumped out. He was holding this little puppy dog and little poodle, and this dog started to kind of like run around these heavyweight gallerists, and he kind of like chased this little dog around in circles, like it was like a charade while they were having this conversation, and it just feels a little like that, like as hard as we try, we're just winging it. It's just sort of nonsense. And there's an aspect to this. Yeah. I don't know.
And that's like the thing that we should embrace, right? We should embrace the running in circles with our dog, or the making these terrible buildings that would fall apart immediately. That's just such a wonderful way of thinking about life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have this illusion that because it's so Baroque and or there's so much, whiz bang to it, and we've controlled these materials, that somehow that secures it, which is not true, So I love that you flipped that. You flipped the structure.
Well, and I have a complete appreciation for the Baroque and the whiz bang. I love the Baroque and the whiz bang, and I am totally wallowing in that stuff when I'm making these pieces. Yeah. But I also love the idea of all of those parts that I've worked so hard on being completely untenable and kind of crumbling to the ground eventually, or maybe like overwhelming you all and having an avalanche.
Yeah.
That's kind of great too.
You're bridging or pulling from two worlds, right? There's sort of the Eastern traditions and the Western traditions, and you're like the perfect candidate for this. The makeup of you is this two world thing. I mean, putting separate things together, and you're belonging and you're not belonging, and all that, that's part of it, right?
Yeah, I'm absolutely. And I think that journey is one that I'm still on. I think when I was younger, the traditional Chinese painting is how I learned how to paint as a teenager.
Oh, really? Like with the black sumi ink?
Yes. Yeah, so that was my first introduction to what painting is.
It's no color. It's just black and white, right? I'm like, they don't use color. It's just black and white.
I mean, in many traditions, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So that's how you started with that?
Yes. So that was what painting was for me, for, my childhood and my teenage self. And then when I started to try to make my own work, I started to kind of shy away from bringing that like very large part of my identity into my work. I didn't want people to think of my work as, oh, this is Asian art instead of like art. I didn't want to be pigeonholed or exotified. And so I kind of shut down this like huge part of who I was in my work. And it's taken me basically, a lifetime to come back around and realize that, this idea of pure abstraction is also actually culturally freighted, and it's often kind of weighed in whiteness, and that I deserved to, show who I was in my work, and that if people saw this work and saw that it was obviously made by a woman or obviously made by an Asian American, those are not negative things. Those are things to celebrate in my work. But it took me a long time to get there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I get all the cultural pressure and fitting in and all that, but the pathway or the journey of a young person, like you get kids in high school, they being different is terrifying. Like you don't want any learning disabilities. You don't want to have anything that makes you different. Fitting in is where you just want to be. It's terrifying. And as you keep evolving, I mean, as work gets stronger, really the reason it's getting stronger is because it's more a better expression of your authenticity, And so that makes sense to me. But you have this extra layer of being from two different places and straddling these big worlds,
Yeah, but I do think that element of the work of, trying to find this place for myself between these larger stereotypes on either side of me, I think that everyone can relate to that. No one feels like they fit into the category that they're supposed to fit into perfectly. And this is kind of, when I make my pieces, I think of them as a celebration of that lack of fitting in, of that in-between place. That's the goal, at least.
Yeah. So the subject of not fitting in or the wandering around, you're painting about that. Your work feels that way,
I'm really happy that comes through because, it's easy to look at my work and just be like, oh, they're like these kind of bombastic, pretty paintings. And that's that. But that is what I'm thinking about all the time. And actually, with my most recent body of work, I've started coming back to those old paintings from when I was a teenager. About a year ago, I was helping my parents clean out their basement. And my mother had saved all of these studies that I had done as a 15-year-old, 16-year-old of bamboo and cherry blossoms, chrysanthemums, these very traditional motifs in Chinese painting that I had just repeated. That's how I had learned, is by copying my teacher and just making dozens upon dozens of these studies on rice paper. And my mother had kept them all. And I found them. There's boxes and boxes of them. So I brought them back to the studio, hung a bunch up on the wall, lived with them for a little bit. And then I started to cut them up, collage them back into my paintings now.
Wow.
And I just loved this idea of that my paintings now can be this conversation or this collaboration between my teenage self and my 39-year-old self. That there's this dialogue happening across decades. There were some that my mother had done, and I kind of put those in there too. And it just felt like this kind of that hybrid self that we've been talking about. It was almost this literal representation of that.
Right. You were, kind of on autopilot, trying to get it right. I'm going to do a cherry blossom, and I'm going to do another one and another one and another one. At some point, maybe I don't want to do cherry blossoms, but this was just the sheer will and beautiful innocence of just trying to get it right. And that is mentorship, right? You just clean the person's brushes for 5 years or whatever, but that's really beautiful to bring that back, actually have the originals that you can glue back in. I love that. When you're making your work, do you to start a new piece? How are you thinking about what's coming up for you? And how do you start a new piece? Do you okay, well, I see this beautiful colored ink and I'm just going to pour it out? Or are there themes or what's been happening in the past work that's now leading you forward?
Those first steps of a painting, that's the part of the painting that I'm the worst at. I don't think of myself as I don't have an overarching concept and then I want to present that concept to you in the vehicle of painting when I make work. And so that was kind of the reason for the pour. The pour kind of takes that decision making away from me.
Oh, I love that.
And so that's why I start with the pour, is it's a sort of this perhaps a shortcut or maybe like a lazy way to begin a painting, is like, well, I'm just going to do this one thing that it's going to make a mark, and then I'll have to respond to that.
Yeah. I mean, you pour a bottle of wine on a beautiful piece of rice paper. I mean, it's going to be pretty damn beautiful.
It's always amazing. Inherently beautiful. It's actually, that's the problem, is sometimes it's too beautiful. And because I'm not actually interested in the pour as like a standalone thing. That's like what Morris Lewis did. And I'm not Morris Lewis.
Or Helen Frankenthaler,
Helen Frankenthaler is actually a much better example than Morris Lewis. But, I'm not interested in just stopping there. Like, I'm interested in the impurity of like confusing that language. But it does help to kind of begin the piece. And in terms of like what it is, a lot of the time it's sumi ink that's getting poured and water. A lot of the time it is just my old paint water from the previous painting.
Is it rice paper?
Onto rice paper. It can be rice paper. I do it on watercolor paper. I work a lot with Yupo paper, which is a synthetic paper. It's completely non-absorbent. So if I make a pour, all of the ink will just kind of sit on top, and then it slowly evaporates over time and leaves these alluvial marks. It's very beautiful.
Oh, so what's that paper called? That's cool. It's
called Yupo. It's a brand. You can buy it on Blick.
Oh, it's like that vellum stuff, right? Is it YUPO?
YUPO.
Okay, we'll have a link in the show notes of this. Yeah, I actually have gotten some of that before. Yeah, so it doesn't absorb, but it leaves these. That's how you're getting those gorgeous. And you know what's so amazing?
It's so simple too. My kids do it for me. It's like the easiest thing.
But what I love about you're using materials in a way that they naturally want to be used. Like if we take a picture of, one of your beginnings and you send a drone up above the Amazon River basin of where it hits the Pacific Ocean or whatever, like it's the same kind of things are going on in nature naturally, right? Cloud formation, water formation, erosion, all that's mirrored, that's the realism part almost of your landscapes in a way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And that absolutely goes back to that interest in juxtaposition, because I love being able to have the mark of my hand, but then also the mark of evaporation, the mark of fluid dynamics. These outside forces that are not me are also making the mark.
That's that beautiful juxtaposition of, well, it's control and not control, but bigger worldly marks that are, like existential, big universal themes. And then you're like trying to like render or, imitate the seaweed on the beach or whatever, there's that beautiful close up and big, because it, like if you stare in a lava lamp, what's going on in there, like you feel, it's pretty powerful,
Yeah, it is. And I love being able to have that kind of majesty that's inherent in these natural processes.
That's the word.
Have that next to me and my, patheticness or like, my human frailty. So like having awkward drawing next to that, or perhaps very, very careful drawing, but it's still coming from, this one lady who's me.
Or this young girl who was just making blossom after blossom after blossom, Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. The majesty is absolutely the right word for that. That's so
right.
So
but
cool.
I don't want just majesty, that's not Morris Lewis.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah. In a way, it's like Helen Frankenthaler was so good. Mm-hmm. I just don't want to go near it. I'm just terrified because she did that so well,
Exactly. Yes.
Or the whole abstract expressionism, like that thing I mean, I can't think of it without thinking of her work, but I love that you're just starting there,
Yeah, I'm not trying to compete with Helen.
No. So, this idea, which I'm always talking about, and it's kind of like the theme of this podcast, is this idea of artists find their way as they go. Like, I love that. I love that whole way of living, art making, and everything. And I mean, how you're describing how you source your current work and then the next painting is that, right? The process is showing you where you want to go. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the paintings evolve, and they're very much they kind of grow, and they're very awkward for a really long time. They look, they're often very embarrassing, and they look terrible for a long time before. Hopefully they don't, or maybe, who knows? I have a lot of kind of failed paintings in a pile in the studio that hopefully will turn into something along later down the road. But I'm a big believer in that kind of slow evolution.
Yeah.
From painting to painting and within the painting as well, within the process.
How do you describe, when it's working, I mean, all I've seen is the things that are working. I didn't, I'd love to see the reject pile, but like when it's working for you, you've talked about your work. I saw an interview or something where you're talking about, it's not really accessibility, but it was the idea of windows and openings and a way in for people and a way out. There's a sort of breathability to your work. Is that part of like a successful thing for you? How do you describe when it's working?
I'd say that breathability, that word is really important, I think, because with my work, it's so busy and full that often it doesn't feel it stops breathing. It kind of suffocates itself, or it can. And that line is something that I'm very interested in. I don't want to make a perfectly balanced painting. I want the painting to be too much. But how can it still have moments of rest or moments of in and out without going to the traditional methods of perspective and space, which is, is not the way that I paint. So I play a lot with the idea of negative space, with layering. My negative spaces are not always negative spaces, depending on who you are when you're looking at them. And they feel very kaleidoscopic. And they get their sense of breathability through layering and juxtaposition rather than actually having like big white areas. There's not that many big white areas happening in my work.
Well, you have the openings, but there's things. Do you think about? I think about this all the time, and when I'm diagnosing my own work. Like, okay, this is a quiet conversation, and then this is like the loud conversation. Do you think about that, like how you organize it, like the main thing that I want people to feel from a distance, or the quiet thing? Because you're kind of doing that, but it's also very, when you say kaleidoscopic, you put your eye up to that thing and you look through that kaleidoscope, and it's like amazing, but it's all kind of at the same volume. And I have trouble doing that. It's hard for me to do that. And I mean, you're kind of pulling that off. Like, but do you have to tune things down? Is that how you work at it, or cut them out? Or
I mean, I actually do a lot of erasure and taking things away. It's just not apparent always because it seems like it's just gotten built up and built up and built up. But it's absolutely necessary to dial things back as well. I think that's just so much a part of the painting process. It's always easy to go too far. I'm an over painter and over worker in every sense. And so it's always
too,
a struggle.
Yeah. I always thought, with everything, if you can do well, if you do this much, well, I'll double that, and it took me a long time to realize, like, it's such flawed thinking, but I go too far. And then I have to back up. I'm never able to stop myself. I only can stop myself when it's very obvious that I've gone too far. I was always amazed. I mean, and brush painting is kind of like, they nail it, like, God, just with one stroke, or it's complete.
Yes.
I never have been able to do that.
No, honestly, neither have I. Obviously, neither have I guess. If you look at the paintings, those are definitely not stopping at one stroke at all. I actually worked for a little while as a graphic designer, and I was a terrible graphic designer because I just want to keep on going. And I'm not about the minimalist one image or one gesture and that packs a punch. I'm more about the building and building and building until somebody tells me to go home.
Yeah, right. It's embarrassing, or it takes a long time, but there's I feel like I'm crawling around on the bottom of the sea, looking for things, and in the accumulation of stuff and throwing them away, and I go backwards 2 steps and forward, I can get to something, but I think for me, the process of the grope, as how I make things, it's just like, and I sense that a little with how you make things as well. But your things feel more, they just feel lighter, like they're just, they're lacy. And I think there's a lightness to your work, which is kind of amazing because it's so layered and complex. And I don't know.
Well, if you think about lace, that's another great word. Like the idea of lace is actually an idea of a ton of labor, repetitive labor over and over on itself. Lace itself is actually extremely maximalist, even though it is so light. So, maybe that's something to think about.
Right. And, you go one step further and the silk making and all that, that's the whole Eastern thing. But I was sharing your work with a friend, and she was saying, oh, it's like butterfly wings. It had this light butterfly thing. When butterfly wings are, it's just like that, actually,
I love that.
Anyway, that's pretty cool. So I'm curious, is this gouache? Is this acrylic? I know you said you use ink. Do you use oil paint? Will you use saran wrap? Do you care?
I'm mostly acrylic. It's, it's always ink. There's a lot of ink. All the blacks are always Sumi ink. But then mostly acrylics that I'm watering down and using in a watercolor-like way. I used to work with watercolors, but I work so large that it just doesn't make sense labor-wise and financially. So yes, it's generally a combination of acrylics and ink, unless it's a public piece, and then it will sometimes have latex paint or house paints. But it really depends on the scale and if it's supposed to be indoor or outdoor.
Yeah. If it's outdoor, how are you supposed to do that? Can you make your work so it's weatherproof?
I only have a few outdoor pieces. With the public art that I do, I usually focus on indoor public art, but I have done some exterior murals, and that's when house paint comes into the equation.
Okay, yeah. All right, yeah. No, so it's totally bomb waterproof.
Yeah, right.
So what are you most excited about? Kind of in wrapping up here, what's coming for you, or what do you sense is coming for you? Probably is more accurate.
Well, in terms of things that we're making, we spent all this time talking about paper and ink and fluid dynamics, but actually recently I've been making some mosaic work. And that might seem really different. I don't know if it does, but I'm really into it right now.
You mean like pieces of plates glued on and then grouted?
Right. Yes. Wow. Ceramic elements or glass elements grouted together on wood. But then I'm not stopping at that. Usually the idea of mosaic is actually this kind of very pure technical idea of that you have your glass mosaic or your ceramic or your stone, you're grouting it, that's the end of the piece. You never do anything on top, but I'm kind of using the mosaic as a substrate And then collaging rice paper on top or painting on top of the mosaic itself. So it's this idea of layering taken to a slightly more textured degree. So that's what I'm kind of focusing on now. And then in terms of exhibitions and where I'm, projects, I just finished a residency at the Tides Museum, Tides Institute, which is in Maine, Eastport, Maine. And I did a collaborative mural on the window there with members of the community, which is still up. That was such a joy. And I have a group show up in New York City right now at AIR Gallery in Brooklyn.
Wow. And I see, you have one daughter?
I have one daughter and one son.
Okay, yeah. And it looks like peering in from the outside, it's so cool. Like they're involved a little in this, and you're a mom, but you're also making your art. And I'm not a mom. I was married to a mom, and it's just damn impressive. You seem so happy, and you're incorporating everything, right? Like you're pulling this off beautifully.
Well, I don't know about that.
Kid, don't you think? Or is it like how do you balance it all? I mean, that's just a lot, having kids and doing these, and like you're like going and doing a residency. Like, do they come? I mean,
They came. Yes, they came.
Wow.
So, I mean, I think in terms of like, how do people balance parenting and art? It's not so much on like, is the artist themselves a superhero? Is she a super mom or not? It's really like, does she have the support structure? Are people helping her? Are those residencies family friendly? And this one is. And I only look for residencies that are going to allow my family to come with me and actually be supportive, which is becoming more and more common. It's still relatively rare, unfortunately, but it's getting better.
Yeah.
And this residency, I brought my kids. They helped with this window installation.
Wow.
I found babysitters in the community. They had a blast. They went to the beach every day. I made paintings. It was, it worked, but it worked because of I had help.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm probably influenced by, I work with a lot of artists, and a lot of artists trying to come back into their art. And what has taken a lot of them out was the care that they had to give to others. And, they weren't able to they just couldn't, and I know this is going to be your story, and what you're doing and how you're describing it, is going to be inspiring for a lot of people. It's really great,
It's not easy. I'd say like of all the things, in terms of how, it's not like it's an easy life to be an artist. It's hard to make money. Anyway. It's hard to find time, but trying to balance the caretaking of being a mom of young children and then just finding time in the studio is a constant struggle. I definitely don't have the answers.
But also the cool part of it is, we think of it in like, well, God, it just takes a lot of energy, but what they get out of it, like I've always taught these workshops, these destination workshops, and I did it before I had kids. And then when our kids were really young, and I always brought them, and these girls, they've grown up now, but like they would sit with like the people that would come to these workshops were really, fabulous art people. And they got so good at talking to people, and they're still good at talking to people. And it was just a great thing to involve them in, so I'm sure that your kids are getting, think of that, what their experiences they're having because of this, meeting new people, seeing what what they're created, and all that. It's really, really cool.
It's an enormous privilege for all of us, that we're able to. They got to go to Maine. It was great.
Yeah, totally. That's so cool. Well, gosh. So, we're going to put a bunch of links on this. You have any exhibitions coming up or anything you want to just remind us of, or, anything that, obviously there'll be links if people can can see your work, and you show your work at Dolby Chadwick. I know that in San Francisco, but where else might people, I'm looking for exhibitions or anything coming up in the near term.
I show my work at Dolby Chadwick. I also have a gallery in DC called Morton Fine Art.
Okay.
And then another one in Toronto called Lonsdale Gallery. any of those 3 cities, my work is there. And then the show in New York is at AIR Gallery, which is a co-op gallery in Brooklyn.
Oh, that's cool. Wow. Okay. Well, listen, in closing, just, we get a lot of listeners, I know, that, maintaining the kind of keeping momentum and keeping fired up and being able to stand there and talk about your work and still be excited about it and all the things, like, can you kind of leave us with maybe a thought or two of just about how you just kind of keep going with this and stay buoyant, and any like ideas around that? I know the listeners would love to hear it, as I would.
I mean, I certainly don't have answers about that. That's such a challenge, I think, for all of us all the time. But I'd say that with every painting, no painting is like, oh, I've finished the painting and now I have the answers. I found all the answers. Every painting kind of opens up new questions. So that's the way to kind of keep an engine going for yourself, is to always be kind of aware and open to what those questions are, and bring them into the next work or the next body of work or the next sculpture or the next book or whatever it is that's going to happen, to kind of keep that propulsion from your previous work moving you forward.
It's the momentum that almost creates the balance, Right. But I love that idea.
And often those are the failures. Like, those are the things in the last piece that didn't work that well, or maybe had the potential to work really well, but you didn't have the space, or it wasn't the right context to really explore it in that last project. So maybe it could be further explored in the next one.
Yeah.
I think just kind of being open to that is really important. And then the second thing, that's kind of being open to your failures creatively. And then I'd also say, like, being generous with yourself to any supposed failures professionally, because the artist's life is just full of failure and rejection, and just being really generous with yourself around that, because it's not fair out there.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, I love that idea of almost like harvesting, you're making art, but you're harvesting questions that allow you to continue. That's beautiful.
That's a good way to put it. I like that. I'll keep that in mind.
Katherine, listen, thank you so much. I could talk all day, but I know that you guys got to see your work. Thank you so much. Really, it's been an honor to catch up with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such a joy.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Art2Life show. If you enjoyed the podcast, please help me get the word out by sharing it with your friends on Instagram at Art2Life_world. The recording of this and all episodes, along with a place to leave comments, see additional photos, and discover a whole new approach to making art, can be found by going to Art2Lifepodcast.com. And secondly, if you could leave a rating and review in whatever app you're listening on today, I would super appreciate it. It makes a big difference. And last but not least, before you go, if you'd like to be on my artist list, every Sunday morning I send out a video blog all about art making. Go to Art2Lifepodcast.com to sign up. And all these links are in the show notes, of course. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.